The 1970s, or the Bronze Age of comic books, was a fascinating time for comic books. It was a time where publishers, new and old, were pushing all kinds of titles to the newsstands and to the spinner rack. Marvel and DC pretty much dominated the market at this time. But there are still some notable publishers. And in this video, I'm going to go over some of these kind of what I would call scarcer comic books by these publishers from my collection. Alright, let's jump right in. If you grew up in the 70s, then you know for sure about the $6 Million Man. Joe Staton, who is better known for his work on E-Man, did this great cover. And notice it's a painted cover. Charlton used a color separator that could handle painted covers cheaply. And so artists like Joe Staton, Don Newton, and even John Byrne were able to do some painted covers for their comic books. Unfortunately, these painted covers were never returned to the artists. Well, in Joe Staton's case, anyway. These are the kind of books that really pull hard on the nostalgia strings. And this is a series that actually lasted quite a few issues. I believe, in my opinion, the cover for number 1 is the best. But I don't own any of the other issues anymore. What I've done over the years to kind of thin out my collection is to just keep the first issues, with the exception of certain titles. It's one way of keeping my collection to a more manageable level, but that's always a challenge. And of course I have to show the sister title, which is The Bionic Woman, that came out a few years later. Certainly not as nice of a cover as the $6 Million Man one. Actually, I'm going to say this is a pretty terrible cover, but still very nostalgic and a lot of fun. Charlton comic books often get overlooked or passed by collectors. And part of it could be due to the fact that the overall quality of the package may not be as good as the others. But it's not to say that they don't have any interesting comic books. And if you want a good challenge, looking for high-grade examples of Charlton books from the 1970s would certainly be a good one. Charlton's an interesting company in that they handled all the business in terms of start to finish of the comic book publishing part by themselves. So they hired artists and writers, and then they printed their own comic books using their own presses, and they had their own distribution system. So, in many ways, that was pretty advantageous for them as a company. Charlton also used licensed characters, and they also had the Hanna-Barbera licenses for quite a while. This is a copy of Hanna-Barbera Summer Picnic number 3, and these are very tough to find in nice shape. I suspect this copy was actually either like a warehouse copy or a file copy of some kind, because when I did buy it, it looked like it was in unread condition. Now, for some of these Hanna-Barbera books, you got to be careful because the inside have like puzzles and cutouts. So always take a look inside to make sure that these books are complete. And this is a special giant issue, which was also kind of not common in their runs. Charlton published a lot of Flintstone titles. Not only did they have like the main Flintstone run, but there was also Barney and Betty. And in a previous episode, I also showed a copy of Dino. With the exception of maybe the first issue, other issues, when you come across them, they shouldn't really be very expensive. This is the only Charlton romance book I own, and it's a copy of Love and Romance number 19. They actually did have quite a few romance titles, and you would be surprised at how expensive some of these romance Charlton books can be in high grade. Like several $100s, but they are very rare and they're very hard to find in high grade. Western Publishing had been around for a long time, and they originally were partnered with Dell, but in the 1960s they decided to split from that partnership. And what happened was they started publishing their own comic books under the label Gold Key. Gold Key at this time were predominantly publishing comic books using licensed characters from Hanna-Barbera, like Scooby-Doo or the Flintstones, as well as using content from TV shows. And while a lot of these comic books are not necessarily have enduring characters like Marvel and DC with their superheroes, there's still a very strong nostalgic element to them, especially the TV stuff. The cartoon stuff, if you're familiar with that content from back then. Gold Key did a lot of kid shows, adaptations in comic book form, and this is H&R Puffin Stuff #1. Some people don't like photo covers, but honestly, in my opinion, I think photo covers are great. Another great first issue, this is George of the Jungle #1, a popular cartoon series from the 1960s. Pretty tough in grade. This series only lasted 2 issues, though. This is a copy of Dr. Spectre #1. If you want a good challenge, try looking for his first appearance, which appeared in a digest, also published by Gold Key, which I'll show you a picture of on the left. Great painted cover of the first issue of The Occult Files of Dr. Spectre. This is actually the first issue of Buck Rogers in the 1970s. Now, there was also an issue in the mid-1960s, but this is actually the first issue that is based on the movie adaptation that would eventually become a very popular TV series. Now, the annoying thing with Gold Key is often with the covers, you can't tell what number the issue is, but in some cases you can. And this is one of the examples. If you look in the top left corner there, it actually has a little tiny #2. Gold Key did a lot of Disney film adaptations, and this is an issue of the Aristocats. These are tough to find with the poster intact on the inside. And actually, if you're missing the poster on this comic book, like the value is half or less. When you're looking for stuff like this, if you can find the ones with the posters inside, that is a really big bonus. One of Gold Key's most enduring titles and long-lasting titles is Star Trek. And this is one of the later issues. This is one of the better painted covers that actually has the USS Enterprise. Some of the early issues with painted covers are kind of neat to look at, but I've just found trying to read these, they can be kind of tough. But maybe one of the most popular Gold Key titles, just because there are a lot of Star Trek fans out there. Gold Key also experimented with what I would call these higher quality format books. They called these a Dynabrite comic. And these had a thicker card, almost like a cardstock cover with higher quality paper used on the inside. The cover price is like 69 cents, which is, I think, like maybe around 3 times what the normal cover price was at that time. And these are reprints from the series as well, too. And I think these are great in terms of like the print quality and the packaging. And they do have other like titles in this kind of format. The Star Trek ones obviously are the more popular ones with collectors. And one more Gold Key example, it's Gold Key Spotlight #1, Tom, Dick, and Harriet. Yeah, try finding a complete run of this series. Gold Key Spotlight featured a various number of different characters. It's almost kind of like a showcase kind of title. Very tough and great. I mean, hard to find in any kind of condition, just because these weren't really very widely collected. One other item I wanted to show is this, and this is a Whitman 3-pack. So Western Publishing, what they did was they would bundle 3 comic books from Marvel, DC, and their own into these 3-packs and sell them for a cheaper price than cover price. So normally if you wanted to buy these 3, it would be $1.20, but you could buy them for $1.09, and some of them were like 99 cents as well too. So a lot of people think that what's on the inside are kind of like second prints or Whitmans, but they actually came out at the same time or relatively close to the same time as the original comic books. But yeah, as you can see, it's got this Whitman product in the bottom left corner, which I think is kind of neat. These, you can still find these, especially the Star Wars ones. Some of the other ones can be harder to find, like the later DC ones, certainly. But it's just kind of a cool kind of item. But yeah, as you can see, there are 3 comic books inside. The bag is not in the greatest shape, but, you know, a Whitman product. Atlas Seaboard was a spectacular blip in the 1970s for comic books. Now, it was originally founded by Martin Goodman, and, you know, in some ways they were very progressive because they paid artists and writers more money, as well as letting the original art go back to the creators. But what killed them was they had a lot of distribution problems. And, if you can't distribute your comic books properly, well, you can't sell them. And as a result, a lot of the titles only lasted 4 issues or less. And, for a time, they had like over 20 titles. I used to have a lot of these Atlas Seaboard titles because, well, I'd always find them in the cheapie bins, like often like for like a quarter a piece. And to be honest, they're not the greatest comic books. I would even say some of them are pretty hard to read. ComicTropes has a great episode on Tiger Man, one of these Atlas Seaboard titles that is definitely worth checking out. And I'll leave a link to his episode in the description below. This is a copy of Ironjaw #1. It has a Neil Adams cover. Unfortunately, it doesn't have Neil Adams art on the inside, but one of the few Atlas comic books that I've kept, mostly because of the Neil Adams cover. And not only did he do the cover for #1, but he also did the cover for #2, which I think is even more striking. So generally, these Atlas comics, you can still find them fairly easily. Maybe the later issues of some titles can be tough, but they also did publish a magazine that has kind of received a little bit of heat lately called Devilina, I believe, just because the rights of these Atlas characters have been brought up in film rights or something recently. And so some of these kind of characters or titles have been getting a little bit of activity, but to be honest, I'm very doubtful anything will materialize out of these characters. But yeah, Ironjaw, #1 and #2, great covers by Neil Adams, an example of Atlas Seaboard titles from the mid-1970s. One of the most interesting publishers from the 1970s has to be Spire Christian Comics. Spire Christian was able to license Archie in many of their comic books, as well as adapt many Christian books and films for their comic books. So this is one of the first Spire Christian comics that were published, and it's God's Smuggler. It's a story about Brother Andrew, who would smuggle Bibles into communist countries. A lot of these Spire Christian comics were drawn by Al Hartley, and if you'll notice, it's also distributed by Fawcett. These were reprinted several times, and they have different cover prices with different printings. So this one has a 35-cent. I believe this is maybe a first print. The other ones have like 39-cent cover prices, 49-cent, 59-cent covers. It's interesting because they're typically double the cover price of other comic books during that time period. So this is easily the most notorious cover of a Spire Christian comic book. So this is a copy of Hansi, an autobiographical book by Maria Ann Hirschman about her life accounts growing up in Czechoslovakia. Now, it's kind of interesting. I have a funny story about buying this book. I only recently bought this book within the past couple years, and I bought it at the Silver Snail, which is a comic book store in Toronto. But this book was not available in the back issue bins or in the front. When I was talking to the cashier about some of the comic books he had in the bins, he actually mentioned this book, which I was aware of, and he said he couldn't put the book out on sale because the cover can just kind of trigger people, and I completely understand why. I want to show you something else that's very cool about this copy. So, and these are Christian comic books, and on the back here as well, it also has a stamp of the church where these comic books were given. And you can actually see some of the other titles that were published by Spire Christian. The one that's kind of missing, there it is. It's Hello, I'm Johnny Cash, which I'd love to get a copy of. And maybe one day I will. Certainly a lot of interesting titles that they published. But there you go. This is a copy of Hansi, and it's actually kind of collectible because of it has such a controversial cover, such a striking cover, that it is sought after by collectors. But yeah, they would probably, like myself, kind of keep this hidden in the back of one of their boxes because the cover does not reflect the content of the book. because, you have many other war comic books that have, the swastika in the background, American soldiers fighting like German soldiers. That symbol is always kind of around. Sure, in the context of those kind of battles, it seems okay, appropriate, but in this one, it certainly looks like it is a propaganda piece and not necessarily a positive one. But if you read the story, it's actually quite an amazing story about this woman and her life escaping Czechoslovakia and coming to America. Yeah, her experience with Germany at that time in the Second World War. So yeah, worth checking out. There are a lot of other publishers from the 1970s, like Fawcett, Harvey, and Archie, that I should mention, but unfortunately I don't have really good examples of comic books in my collection from those publishers. I think one subset of Archie that I would actually be kind of interested in looking at are Red Circle Comics, as they did publish a few kind of horror fantasy titles in the 1970s that I think are actually worth looking out for. One more independent book I want to show you is this issue of Imagine #1. This is actually a second print under, I believe, Star Reach Publications. And the lineup in this issue is actually pretty impressive. It actually has a story written by Neil Adams. Not drawn, but written by Neil Adams. Also one by Marshall Rogers and an early Dave Sim story who is well known for his Cerebus run. This came out in the mid-70s, I believe. I mean, if you look at the cover price, $1.50, very expensive. This is kind of more of an adult-themed, like maybe heavy metal-ish kind of comic book. Yeah, it's like an independent publisher that, it was popular enough that they did a second printing. An interesting 1970s book that I think is worth taking a look at. And that's Imagine #1. Now, where do I buy these comic books? Well, in Toronto, there's actually this one famous store called Silver Snail, and they've been around since the 70s. And they've moved locations a few times, but they're back on Queen Street. And, whenever they have a sale, I'll still go down and check out what they have. Because, you know what? They still have a very good back issue selection. And definitely worth checking out. If you enjoyed this video, I do have 2 other similar videos on this topic. One about DC and one about Marvel that you can check over here. And until next time, enjoy and read your comic books.